Dedicated in 1943 on the 200th anniversary of his birth, is the third of the three great national monuments erected in this capital city, the earlier two being the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. What this monument celebrates above all else is the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson wrote, a document that sets forth the basic and controlling political principles that underlie the Constitution of the United States. I am Mortimer Adler, and this is America's Testament. It was Jefferson's wish that he should be remembered first of all as the author of the Declaration of Independence. It is therefore entirely appropriate that the inscription on the first panel in this magnificent building is composed of stirring words drawn from that document. On the second panel are engraved the words with which Jefferson introduced his Act for Religious Freedom in the Virginia Assembly in 1779. On the third panel, we find 6 quotations from Jefferson's writings that express his thoughts on liberty and on the importance of educating the people who are citizens of the Republic. And the fourth panel sets forth Jefferson's views on the need for openness to change in our institutions so that they can develop in the light of changing circumstances. The Declaration of Independence may stand forever as originally written, but Jefferson would have us moderate our reverence for the Constitution by a willingness to adapt it to conditions that could not have been imagined when it was drafted and adopted 200 years ago.
America's Testament will explore the ideas and ideals of the Constitution that challenged the world at the birth of our republic. On this program, The Declaration of Independence, Mortimer Adler's guests are Ellen Futter, president of Barnard College, affiliated with Columbia University in the city of New York, and Charles Percy, former United States Senator from the state of Illinois.
In the preceding program, we discussed the relation of the two bicentennials. The first, in 1976, the bicentennial of the Declaration. The second, now in 1987, the bicentennial of the Constitution of the United States. Today, as an opening question, I would like to ask my guests whether they agree with me, my view of the bearing of the Declaration on the Constitution. Almost all of the very many books that have been written this year, published this year, concentrate solely on the Constitution. The book that I wrote and just been published regards the Declaration as the more fundamental of the two documents, at least so far as the statement of basic political principles goes. The ideas we find in it underlie the ideals set forth in the Preamble of the Constitution. Do you agree with me about the primacy of the Declaration, if not only in time, but also in thought?
Well, I think certainly that it is the underlying and beginning document in terms of its statement of individual rights and the essential principles that find their way into the Constitution. It is not today a binding document in the same sense that the Constitution is.
Binding at all.
Correct. On the other hand, I think that it begins the process, and all of these documents are in process still as we interpret them for today's world.
I certainly agree, Dr. Adler. Because really what it was a message really for the world. It was not necessary to do this to separate, say we're separating, because that was done 2 days before, on July 2nd. Right. The resolutions of separation were there.
In fact, fighting had begun a year before.
Of course. But in the Declaration of Independence, it really summed up, in a sense, everything that had been said, argued back and forth in the Constitutional Convention. It was a message to the world as to why the form of government under which the colonies had lived was absolutely intolerable, a tyranny. And they reiterated that tyranny and then laid out the goal for democracy for years to come in the United States. It's a fundamental guideline for us to follow, and it causes really the changes that we've had ever since then in the Constitution.
I would only challenge one thing that you said. It does not outline democracy. It outlines constitutional government, a republic, because when it says we hold, the we there does not refer to all the population. It refers, when they talk about the consent of the governed, it isn't the total governed.
That's correct.
And when they say all men are created equal, the question is, are they saying all white males are created equal? Or it doesn't say all human beings are created equal. So democracy is not quite the word.
Well, I'll accept that amendment by simply modifying it further by saying what we did was accept our form that we visualized of democracy.
But to underscore your point, I think the Declaration actually is a much more sweeping and intentionally individual rights-oriented document than the Constitution, which indeed sets up the form of government.
But I think democracy, in our sense of our 20th century sense of the term, was not in their minds at all.
I think that's true.
I think they've been against it if you proposed it. You know, the Constitution itself, without its amendments, sets forth few. I doubt if in the look at the 7 articles of the Constitution there are any profound political principles there. The Constitution is really an organization of the offices of government, a grant of powers and authority to them, reservation of rights to the states and to the people, so that in the later amendments there are some basic political principles. The 18th century Constitution, even I think with the Bill of Rights added, is not a statement of political principle as a declaration. That famous second paragraph is. Let me introduce our discussion of the Declaration of Independence by reciting or reading that the opening 5 lines of that second paragraph. Marvelous, marvelous rhetoric indeed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter it, to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, in that paragraph, the key word is really the first word in the first line, created equal. About 2 weeks before Jefferson wrote that, George Mason in Virginia, writing the introduction to the Bill of Rights for that state, said that all men are by nature equal. We hold that all men are by nature equal. And that doesn't say they are endowed with their Creator, but it says inherent in them are certain natural rights. What about equality? That's a key word in the Declaration, and not to be found at all in the Constitution. The key word in the Constitution is liberty.
Well, I think that the equality, the equalness speaks to 2 things. One, that we are all human, that we all have certain qualities and characteristics by being members of the species. The other thing I think it addresses more subtly is equal access to the rights that are inalienable and the rights that become civil rights by virtue of law.
We're all Homo sapiens. That's that distinguishes us from other species. And we have that in common, and that must be what is truly protected.
But you see, when you say that, you are giving a 20th century interpretation to all men are created equal. Because you're saying that the only sense, if I understand your point, Senator Percy, the only sense in which all men, or all human beings, I'll put it that way, are equal by nature, is, as you say, members of the same species. They all are equal in their common humanity. And that word equal there means that one human being is neither more nor less human than another human being. But do you think they had that in mind when they said it? You think they would go as far as I've just gone?
Well, I think that we're presented in this country with a history that is flawed, that we can't escape by this grand document or by mere interpretation of it. We have had a serious, profound, long, bitter struggle over matters of race and even gender, and they are inescapable. Having said that, I think that the appropriate interpretation, whether the founders would have articulated it this way at that time or not, is that all people are created equal, men, women, black or white.
You repeated the word created.
By nature, I think is preferable, frankly.
The reason why I think that's so, and I'd like to see if you agree with me about that, to make a truth self-evident, or to state a truth that is self-evident, it must be undeniable because the opposite is unthinkable. Now, it is possible to think that we are not, I mean, there are atheists and non-believers who do not think we are created by God. Some people don't even believe that God exists or that there is a creator. So that, and endowed by their creator, it contains the same problem. But if you change it as Mason wrote it, that they're all by nature equal, your point about being of the same species, of the same specific nature, and that the rights, they're not endowed by their creator, but they're inherent in their nature, then it is self-evident, is it not?
I think that by nature is a safer phrase, though I think it might be worth saying that created, though it was not intended this way, could also mean born, which is an interesting cut on it. I think the other essential point, though, was the reach for something higher than government from which to derive the right to take the action that they were taking.
I would think the two ways one can reach beyond government is to say, refer to the divine sources of our powers and our status, but it's also, if you talk about the inherent nature,
correct,
you are going beyond anything the government does. Would you say that regarding all human beings as equal has very serious political consequences?
It does have, and it's very interesting that Jefferson really didn't have to put this in the Declaration. If the Declaration were merely to be a reason why they're separating, why they're overthrowing the government, and why they're going to war. But what he was doing was putting in the framework for the future.
No question about it.
And what he was saying is that no matter what the nature of the problem, rationality is what mankind has in common.
Yeah.
We have the right and the ability to reason through our problems. Unlike the highest form of animal life, the lowest form of human life really had rationality.
That's right.
So you have to then, no matter what that problem is, whether it's a problem of equality of education, whether it's an equality of opportunity for economic advantages and general welfare, whether it's the right for health and health care, debates we're carrying on right now on reforming Medicare, giving catastrophic insurance and catastrophic allowances, all of these go right back to the very fact that we all have that one thing in common, the right to equality of opportunity.
Yeah, but you see, I think what Lincoln said about the Declaration, thinking of that crucial second paragraph, which, by the way, Senator Percy, you're quite right, Jefferson could have skipped from the first paragraph to the statement of all the abuses, because the second paragraph is not of the essence of the Declaration. It is really, as you say, his attempt to say what we would like to have as a government in place of the one we're abolishing or overthrowing. Lincoln, looking at that second paragraph, said, this isn't a statement of what these men thought was existing at the time, it's a pledge to the future. Now that, I think, is, because everything you say speaks to that pledge.
It's also an explicit statement, I think, about the purpose of government, which is to create conditions which allow for the liberties, the pursuit of happiness themselves to flourish, which is a very particular and sophisticated statement of the purpose of government.
But certainly, if one of the immediate consequences, at least as I see it, of saying that all human beings are equal is to say they all deserve equal treatment in equal conditions of life, in some basic sense of equal conditions. Not just, I would go a little further than you, I think, Senator Percy, not just equality of opportunity, but some equality of condition as well. The thing that Tocqueville in 1835 said that what was happening when he talked about democracy in America, said that what was happening in this country is some motion toward a universal equality of conditions. So it's just a little more than equality of opportunity.
In economic terms.
Yes, economic.
It's really I don't think any of us really appreciate how revolutionary this was. Yeah. This is truly a revolutionary thing. It's the equivalent of an atomic bomb, really. It is an explosive idea that created a form of government that it'll take hundreds of years for us to implement it fully. We are a long ways from fully implementing the spirit
no question about
that
it.
Jefferson embodied in
You see,
the Declaration.
I would say the two most revolutionary events in the whole history of the West, and I limit myself to the West, as revolutionary in our political life as the invention of the wheel is in the process of technology, is first the invention of constitutions by the Greeks in the 6th and 5th century BC, or the 7th and 6th century, not Pericles, but Solon in Athens and Lycurgus in Sparta, because the beginning of constitutional government is an absolute, before that, all human beings were slaves or subjects of absolute rulers, of the great king of Persia or the pharaoh of Egypt. And suddenly something new comes into the world, citizenship. But no mention of equality. I mean, the fact that Aristotle can say without contradiction that some men are by nature born to be slaves indicates that his praise of constitutional government is for free men and equals, but not for slaves.
But Cicero talked about justice and a partnership for the common good.
No question about that.
Now that goes back a long time, and Jefferson, knowledgeable, a man of letters, drew upon all of the past, just as he drew upon the debate that had been raging in the United States for the several years before the Declaration.
Well, then he goes on to say that they're endowed, either endowed by their creator or inherent in their nature, are certain unalienable rights. Now, before Jefferson wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, John Locke had talked about these unalienable rights and called them life, liberty, and property. And again before Jefferson, in those 2 weeks before the Declaration was finally signed, George Mason of Virginia said, have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, and with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Now, the interesting thing is that with these words in front of him, and with Locke behind him, Jefferson made certain deletions. He omitted Locke's and Mason's reference to property, and most important of all, he kept that phrase, pursuit of happiness, but dropped out the means to obtain as well as pursue happiness. Let's look at that for a moment. Why do you suppose he dropped out obtain? In fact, the phrase pursuit of happiness is an extraordinary invention.
Well, I think it speaks really to the other explosive element in the document, which is that it has a moral underpinning. And if you think about the differences in the kinds of happiness, you can obtain personal happiness, but when you pursue happiness in the sense that he alludes to, you're pursuing it, I think, in the old ethical sense of trying to pursue a world that will be better, a collective happiness as well as an individual contentment.
Well, now let me postpone for a moment those two conceptions of happiness, the psychological conception, which is the contentment or satisfaction you and I experience when we get what we want, and the other, the ethical or moral conception of happiness, which goes back to Aristotle, that it's a morally good life, a whole life worth living, well lived. Let me stay with the word unalienable. Clearly means can't be taken away. But I would like both of you to help me with this one. After a just trial, which a jury brings in the verdict of guilty, and the judge properly sentences a man to 10 years imprisonment for some felony, have we taken away his right to liberty? I mean, is the just imprisonment of a man for felonious conduct or even for a misdemeanor a violation of that unalienable right? Or does it take it away? Leave the word violation out. Does it take away the right, which is said to be unalienable, not be able to be taken away?
You have an inalienable right to the access to liberty, but it is not an unlimited access, and the limit of it is that you may not exercise it in ways that infringe on others
Right.
or create danger, and the incarceration results in a temporary withdrawal, not a permanent withdrawal.
Is it a withdrawal of the right or a withdrawal of the exercise of the right?
exercise.
Really the exercise, because the man, a prisoner, could claim that his right to liberty has been violated by a warden who mistreats him in a certain way, even though he has reduced exercise of the right in prison. Now that's easy. The question of imprisonment in relation to the right, the inalienable right to liberty, is easier than the death penalty in relation to the inalienable right to life. Because It isn't the exercise of life. It is life that's being taken away. What do you do about the death penalty, Senator? Have you a stand on that one?
Well, I faced an extraordinarily difficult problem in that regard because of the death of our daughter Valerie, who was murdered, assassinated in our home. And I had to think that through very, very carefully. I still took the floor of the Senate when we had a vote, and Senator Hughes commented on it later. And I simply said, I do not believe that the right to life can be taken away by the state. And when it is taken away by someone else, that doesn't give us the excuse to then take it away. Possibly, if it's a life term being served and a prisoner kills a guard, there is no deterrent then, because he just has the same penalty. But in this kind of a case, there are so many mistakes. We had 13 confessions. Which one of those that confessed to that crime actually committed it? It's so irreversible once you commit the death. And therefore, and I think really, it doesn't give the person a chance to say they're wrong, to have recompense for it, and it's too easy. They ought to suffer and think it through and finally come to grips with it and come to God and finally have them realize what's wrong. So I really voted against the death penalty under the most extraordinary circumstances, and Senator Hughes could not have been more understanding and loving, really, and caring in the remarks that he made after my position was made clear on the floor of the Senate.
I think it's remarkable that in the long history of this matter, it's only in very recent years, in this country, certainly in this century, that there's been a rising opposition to the death penalty. A number of states have abolished it, have they not? England has abolished it, has it not? The only pragmatic defense of it is, as you say, the deterrence of others from committing a serious crime. But I would say your suggestion of life imprisonment with no opportunity for probation or parole would be as serious a punishment with the same deterrent effect.
There's justification there, but all the studies done by your University of Chicago Law School, I studied all of them. And the studies that were made then, that the crimes of passion, there are so many between friends, relatives, family, etc., that wouldn't be a deterrent whatsoever. And if it were a true deterrent, then there'd be justification. But in most cases, it's not a real deterrent, except in this one case that we have mentioned. But I think, Dr. Adler, getting back to your original premise on it seems clear to me, it clears it up for me when I look at inalienable rights as something that can't be done away with, taken away, no matter the tyranny. That's what that's what Jefferson was coping with the Declaration, the tyranny under which the colonials lived.
The rights would be violated.
But if it's given to you by law, then it can be taken away.
Oh, absolutely.
And we have the right to do so. And there is the difference between alienable and inalienable.
Absolutely.
And that word, inalienable rights, is something we really have to understand and appreciate to truly understand what kind of a government was given to this nation.
There are 3 adjectives, or 4 adjectives, that are placed before the word rights, leaving the word unalienable for a moment outside. They're called human rights, they're called natural rights, and they're called civil rights. Now, I would say of those 3, the 2 of them go with unalienable and 1 doesn't. Human rights are inalienable. Natural rights, and the reason is the one you gave, namely, since they're not given by the state, they can't be taken away by the state. Only civil rights, which are the gift of the state, awarded by the state through legislation, can be revoked. But tell me, since these rights are unalienable, why does Jefferson, we must say, if they can't be taken away, why should they be secured? What do you think the word, the word secured seems a little bit antithetical to the notion of the rights being unalienable. But were violated by the king, were they not?
I think that's the point. That's the historical piece of this, that these are the things that they wish to say are the ones that the state cannot interfere with. These are the ones that the state of Great Britain did interfere with, and for which there was revolution. I think that's the entire historical predicate.
The nature of the radical nature of the Declaration seems to be summed up in the pursuit of happiness. Because really, when you do pursue happiness. If you achieve happiness, it leaves really nothing more to be desired.
That's very important.
And the means by which you pursue happiness are left to us, but you have to protect the right to be able to pursue happiness, because that's the end goal and objective. What a radical idea to say this is a function of government to protect that right to pursue happiness.
In fact, structurally, the equality is the predicate that leads to three entitlements, namely life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, two of which are themselves conditions precedent to the pursuit of happiness itself.
Among these are life, liberty, and a lot of others we haven't mentioned, all of which are means to an end, the end being, the end is the pursuit of happiness. And therefore, let's look at that for a moment. President Feller mentioned before these two different conceptions of happiness, the psychological conception, which is the regnant one today. If you go to the streets and talk about happiness, everyone thinks of it entirely in psychological terms. You feel happy. I say, Happy New Year. Oh, last month I was happy, but now I'm miserable. That psychological meaning, which changes with the time and circumstances, is dependent upon whether you, on a given day or month or time, you get what you want. And your wants and my wants are different. In fact, I could want something which came into conflict with your wants, so that if the government tried to secure my right to pursue happiness, getting what I wanted, you and I could come into conflict, and no government. It's that fact, Senator Percy, that makes me think that Jefferson did not have the psychological meaning in mind. There's a second reason why I think he didn't. The psychological meaning of the feeling of contentment from getting what you want is something you can obtain. You can enjoy it. The other meaning, the ethical meaning of happiness, a whole life well lived in terms of getting what you need, not getting what you want, is something you don't experience. You can never experience the whole life at any moment. And so you can't obtain that happiness from moment to moment. And that's why I think Jefferson removed the word obtain, which Mason must have had the other meaning of happiness in mind.
You know, if you think about it in the context of today's world, it has to be that it's a moral concept of, an ethical concept of happiness, because if you look today at the kinds of ethical scandals that we have in every area of life, government and every other area, the investment community, etc., those in a sense are all ones that derive from the effort to achieve psychological happiness, but that are in direct conflict with the attainment of a moral pursuit of happiness by people on behalf of the whole.
That distinction, by the way, between wants and needs, I think is one of those profound distinctions you can make to understand our moral values. Because when you want something, at the time you want it, you think it's good. But you often find out after you get what you want that it didn't turn out to be good for you. I mean, you can want something which is really bad for you, though it appears to be good at the time you want it. The curious thing about the word needs, and in talking with students again and again, I've never found it difficult for them to understand this. It's impossible to say you can need something that's really bad for you. Whatever you need, really need, by your nature craves, needs is something that is really good for you. So that if you make the distinction between real goods and apparent goods, real goods are constituted by all the things that satisfy or are a response to your natural needs. And that being the case, can I try my hand at rephrasing, expanding a little that famous line in the Declaration, life, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let me try it this way. We are inherent in our nature, not only our natural needs, but inherent in nature are these unalienable rights because they're based upon our natural needs. Among these are life, liberty, and anything else that any human being needs in order to make an effort to lead a good human life. Now that may bring property back into the picture, maybe bring economic goods back into the picture.
Well, I think, though, that it allows for the distinction that you're driving at, which is the distinction between wanting, which may not be justifiable, and needing, which is broad enough to encompass the potential to need something that is tangible or economic, which may be true in this world to have the kind of enjoyments that the Declaration speaks towards.
What it does also is give justification for worrying about South Africa. A person who has happiness, who has freedom, who has liberty, can't be happy living on this planet, in this earth, knowing that we haven't done enough to try to secure the same rights for other Homo sapiens, other human beings who have rationality and so forth. It also brings the desire to eradicate hunger, not just in this country, and the shelter for people in this country, but hunger around the world. Working there provides a form of happiness for people here who really believe they cannot be happy unless they are doing everything they can to eradicate hunger, intolerance, tyranny, other places in the world, not just the United States of America.
In that sense, the Declaration really is a cosmopolitical document. It applies to all mankind, though it was stated for us in this kind of country narrowly. It really is, and I think it's been so regarded by the peoples of the world.
I think that moral interpretation is also essential to the subsequent language in the Declaration, which picks up on the moral duty, not only in the context of pursuit of happiness, but in the context of review of government. One has a moral duty as a citizen to either consent or not consent, and in the absence of consenting, to take action to overthrow the government. But the underpinning of that duty is indeed moral.
Right. And let me follow what you just said, President Fenner. Earlier in the second paragraph, Jefferson refers to our right to overthrow a government that violates or does not secure these rights. 2 or 3 lines further on down, he says it's not only our right, but our duty. That puzzles me. That's really, we have not only a right to rebel, a right to engage in an insurrection against a manifestly unjust government, we have a duty, a moral obligation. And that's a very strange statement. Seldom said that we have a duty to do it. We have a right to rebel is one thing, but a duty to do so goes further. Why do you think he said that?
Because if the rights are truly inalienable, and if they are higher than those created or conveyed by government in order to ensure their availability, if government exists that precludes access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and fundamental equality, then we must overthrow it. That's the philosophical answer. The practical answer is that if he doesn't so conclude, it's very hard to rebel against Great Britain.
I think that this shows the vision that the Founding Fathers, particularly Jefferson, had. Jefferson knew that war was the easiest way for people to lose liberties. And, of course, all the things he specifically said in the Declaration denouncing King George III and saying they could not quarter troops, they could not do all of these things. But he knew that war did, and yet a war was justified to overthrow these tyrannies.
Taking up arms.
But today it also provides the impetus and the necessity for our working, say, to prevent atomic war. And you and I should feel very strongly about this. Our University of Chicago, the first chain reaction was created underneath Stagg Field.
And we also,
we know that if war, civil war, World War II, World War I, whatever war it was with conventional weapons, if that took away a certain freedom, it gave power to government that they wouldn't have had otherwise. Think what would happen in an atomic war and what freedom would be lost by people all over the world if you had to organize for an atomic war. That gives the impetus for the friends I have spending their lives devoting themselves. Marjorie Benton here in Evanston, Illinois, and Tom Watson, former ambassador to head of IBM and former ambassador to Moscow, spending virtually all his life now to prevent atomic war mistakes because they knew that that would just totally destroy the whole concept of liberty, freedom, the right to pursue happiness.
Not to mention life.
Not to mention life.
Number one, life.
It could not eliminate just all mankind. It would eliminate all forms of life with the weapons, in exchange of weapons that we have now in what, 5 minutes?
And yet it allowed, though, for gradations in the approach to doing that. One can do something shy of overthrowing the government. It allows for an equally radical concept, civil disobedience, which is really quite remarkable.
You're reminding me of the atomic bomb at the University of Chicago. It reminds me also that Hutchins took on that project, the Manhattan Project, though presidents of 5 or 6 universities had turned it down, though he was a pacifist himself. You know. And after the bomb dropped, he created something called a committee to frame a world constitution, which I was a member, and Professor Borghese was the chairman of it. And we used the American Constitution as a basis for drafting a preliminary draft of a world constitution as a way to prevent world war and the use of the bomb as a threat to human life, although it wasn't as serious in 1946 and 7 as it is now. Let me stay with the second paragraph a moment longer. The word justice occurs. The word justice doesn't occur. The word just occurs, and justice is implied. It is said that a just government derives its powers, or a government derives its just powers. A government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. The other thing that's said about a government is that it's just if it secures these rights. The two criteria of the justice of a government is, one, that it secures these unalienable human natural rights. The other criterion is that its powers are derived from the consent of the governed. Now that phrase is usually misinterpreted, I think. All the people in 1776, all the people who were going to be put under this new government were governed, but all were not asked to give their consent. Children were governed, but not asked to give their consent. Those lacking suffrage were governed, but not asked to give their consent. So doesn't it mean the consent of all those who are in a position, all those among the governed who are in a position by reason of suffrage to give their consent? I mean, often the rhetorical force of this document comes from Jefferson's magnificent rhetorical brevity, but the brevity often slips up on us a little bit, because the consent of the governed can be ambiguously interpreted. It should mean, it seems to me, the consent of all those among the governed who are in a position to give their consent by virtue of suffrage.
It's really the exact same problem as arises in the statement, all men are created equal, that they slide by and finesse the fundamental inequities of society then and through the ages to some degree, and lends credence and importance to the fact that it's an evolving interpretation and an evolving capacity to have this kind of government.
Brevity, though, is the genius of so many of our great leaders in this country, and Lincoln was very brief in what he said.
The Gettysburg Address is a magnificent...
echoed all over the world. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. But how much more could you say in those few words?
That is the essence of constitutional government and of good government. And that of those three prepositions, of, by, and for. By is simple, for is simple, of is often misunderstood, just as consent of the governed is misunderstood. It is not a government of the people as the people being governed, but it's the government, it is the people's government, as in the French expression, the hat of my aunt, which becomes the possessive of my aunt's hat. So the government of the people is the people's government. They are the owners, they are the proprietors of the government.
And it's for the people.
Oh, for and by. That, I think, explains why Lincoln was much more indebted in his own thought to the Declaration than to the Constitution.
Well, and he was liberated by it because, given the set of dilemmas that he faced and his essential notion that these were ideals set forth in the Declaration were future ideals, they allowed him a base from which to create that more perfect union.
What year was it that Adams started to detract from Jefferson? 1822. He started to detract by saying that really there were a lot of other people besides Jefferson. He was a little jealous, I guess, of his friend. There were a lot of other people and so forth, and that these weren't really original ideas, and he tried to detract, but that, in a sense, that was again the genius of Thomas Jefferson, because he put together in few words, in words that were just each one a jewel almost, what had been said and was the consent then of what was the feeling of the 13 colonies and the leadership of those colonies at that particular time.
It's also a reflection of the old lawyer's credo that the draftsman has the power.
So. Yeah, that's right. That's
right. That notion, you're saying that Jefferson was drawing upon the whole past. He really was really a magnificently educated person in terms of his political literacy.
That's why it was so quickly adopted. and universally proclaimed in the United States, because it really did represent ground that had been plowed for several years, and that was then, he pulled it all together neatly and beautifully in words that have lived forever, will live forever, way beyond this generation and this age.
The statement about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness had its background in Locke, who said these natural or inalienable rights are life, liberty, and property. But the consent of the government goes back further than that. In 1647, in Cromwell's army, there was a group called the Levelers, and led by Colonel Major Rainborough and Sir John Wildman. They petitioned Cromwell and his son-in-law, Colonel Ireton, for the extension of suffrage to the unpropertied classes in Great Britain. The vast majority of the people, in fact, the property qualification was a 20 shilling freehold. You can see how small it was, but a great majority didn't have that at all. And in their argument against Cromwell, or to Cromwell, for the extension of the suffrage to the poor, the unpropertied, they said, no man is a free man unless he's governed with his own consent and with a voice in his own government. Political liberty, they said it first, political liberty consists in being governed with your own consent and with a voice in your own government. So that phrase, consent of the governed, comes down to Jefferson through English tradition from the Levelers and Locke. It is, by the way, what that means, it seems to me, that notion of consent of the governed, and political liberty, and the notion of citizenship as being, shall I say, the primary office in the land, much more than being a senator or you're first of all a citizen, are you not? You can't be a senator without being, can't be president without being a citizen. So that in some sense, the citizens are the permanent and principal rulers of this country. The office holders, all of the fellows in Washington, the buildings up and down Pennsylvania, are really the administrators of the government, not the government. And I think we recognize this, don't we, when we say at an election, we don't say a change in the government of the United States. The government remains the same as a change in the administration of the government. Do you think most American citizens realize how deep and profound a status they have by reason of being citizens with suffrage? Don't they think of themselves as the governed and the government in Washington?
Oh, I think you're right, that they don't appreciate the, I really should let someone who's been elected answer first.
Am I right in saying that you are not the government?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Those people, I can say that now, you know. But I always had the consciousness that how wonderful the country really ran when we were in recess. That's a salutary thought, you know. And I often thought many times we were better off when we were in recess. The country carries on. It's got basic principles. But what I admire so much is the right of dissent. It was protected in the Declaration of Independence. The right to of dissent on something that government did. And I was well aware of it in the Vietnam War. I went to Washington during the Vietnam War. We were there, if you can remember back, there were troops on Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown. The bridges were all blocked. You couldn't get through by your car. There were so many dissenters, but they were dissenting about a war that they felt was unjust and unrelevant. And we were taxed for that war, and they could see the liberties slipping away through a war thousands of miles from where we were that we didn't have really the will to win because it wasn't worth that much to us at the time. I can think of my own daughter marching on the Pentagon. I just said, darling, I don't mind you doing it, just like probably President Carter said to Amy. But just don't get your picture in the front page of the Chicago newspapers. I don't care about Washington, but Chicago, I don't want to see you.
You were going to say something?
Two thoughts. One is I think there may be a difference in view of the citizenry with respect to its power, which I think they probably don't appreciate how great it is, versus the view of those who are elected who may see it as greater than the citizens themselves do. But secondly, I think that consent also underscores the importance of another concept, namely that of accountability, and how much trouble we get into in this country when our officials, either elected and appointed but with the consent of the Congress, when we have officials who don't go through that process and who are not similarly accountable, because it is the accountability that in turn allows the implementation of the consent of the governed. And that's critical.
The months we have spent on the administration and what accountability they had for their actions in Iran, their actions in Central America. And here the right, and I again would be personal about this, I have a sister-in-law, Carol Geyer, who is J.C. Penney's daughter. And J.C. Penney must wonder, thinking on high, looking at his daughter, protesting in front of the South African embassy, protesting on the use of the CIA in Nicaragua, protesting in peaceful protest, but hoping to get the right to be arrested for it, to demonstrate and prove she's willing to pay the price and the penalty because she wants to protest what we are doing.
And the consent of the governed,
very
the
proud
consent of the governed involves the
right.
dissent of the governed as well.
That's right.
But let's stay with that, because that notion of the consent of the governed is really absolutely crucial to the very nature of constitutional government. I mean, in a monarchy, or an absolute monarchy, or any despotism, you don't have a right to dissent. You can only dissent, if you will, by fighting, but you don't have a legal right to dissent. And your consent is not asked for the government either. You're governed by force that you have no way to resist. What at the time of the Declaration, or I shouldn't say that, at the time of the Constitution, the citizens then with suffrage, who elected or picked their delegates to go to the convention to ratify the Constitution, were giving their consent. By the way, even those who wanted their delegates to vote against the adoption of the Constitution, having accepted in advance majority rule, were giving their consent to the Constitution if it was to be ratified. But that was one moment in the history of this country. How do we, or anyone living since the 18th century, how do we give our consent to the Constitution? Just by exercising suffrage?
I think it's tacit. I think when we elect officials, that's one way. If they're not satisfactory to us, we remove them. We dissent at certain times on specific issues, whether it be South Africa or nuclear war. And more than that, when we talk about that right to dissent, the Declaration is explicit. It's not just a right, it's a duty, as you said before. It's powerful. And thirdly, if it gets so terrible, we, I guess, withdraw pursuant to the requirement of the Declaration.
And how does a person, because I'm thinking back to those years of the late 60s when there was such a large protest against the Vietnam War, how, in fact, does one explicitly withdraw one's consent? I mean, suppose you wanted to, you've given your consent, I've given mine. Suppose I want, in fact, many students did withdraw their consent by doing what?
Well, a lot went to Canada.
That's right, by emigrating.
They emigrated. But I think the important thing, beginning right there at the Constitutional Convention, is a huge fight about the Bill of Rights going into the Constitution. Finally, it was agreed that it would not go in, but then it became the first 10 amendments. By the very fact that they voted against them going in to start with, but then had a chance later to vote on them separately, yes or no. The very fact that you started engaging in that process, you're giving consent, support to the Constitution, just as today. Recently, the 18-year-old vote was one of the earliest fights that I had down there. Should we give the 18-year-old vote? It was the same fight as women's suffrage, and it's the same fight. Do we have a constitutional amendment, as we probably regretfully need, to say you can't have a balance, you can't have an unbalanced budget in the federal government except under extreme circumstances, which many states have today.
Wouldn't you say that when we as a people in our several states vote to adopt a constitutional amendment, we are giving our consent to the Constitution?
Right. Yes.
By very act of amending it, we are giving our consent to it. So there are various ways in which, either tacitly or by our political actions, we do give our consent. I think there's only one way that you can peacefully withdraw your consent, peacefully, and that is to emigrate. That is an explicit withdrawal of consent. And so in some sense, our Declaration of Amnesty, which brought those men back, young men and women back from Canada or from Sweden, was a proper action.
Or we even have the right in this country for the Soviets to publicize the fact that a former citizen of the Soviet Union that came to this country decided to go back, and they make a huge
That's right.
He withdrew his consent.
public relations fact about that he went back. But of course, how many are still there that want to come here, and how many more will follow that one person that went back? not too many, but they have the right to show their dissent here. But Thomas Jefferson would have been, I think, the first ones to be violently against the tyranny of Nazism, the tyranny of totalitarian communism, as practiced in Nicaragua, as practiced in the Soviet Union, as practiced wherever it may be practiced. But we have that right to oppose that, but those principles would have made him an anti-communist because of the fact that tyranny does exist, and the whole Bill of Rights doesn't exist in the Soviet Union today. And they're changing. They're changing dramatically right now.
In the time we have left, I'd like to spend a moment on the first paragraph of the Declaration. Let me read it out loud for a moment. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. Now, that paragraph, as I said before, should lead into the statement of all the abuses and the grievances they had asked for redress for. Instead, they have that second paragraph, which is an interruption of the thought. But looking at that first paragraph, let me ask you, in 1861, when Jefferson Davis proclaimed the secession of the southern states from the Union over the slavery issue after Lincoln was elected, could Jefferson Davis have used this paragraph without changing a word as the opening paragraph of his declaration of the secession of the southern states from the Union? What do you think about that?
Which word do you have in mind?
Well, when it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which are connected with another. That is, the southern states were connected by political bands. They're joining the Union back in 1776, but now they think it's necessary to dissolve them. Do they have a right to assume among the peoples of the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of God and of nature entitle them? Well, why was Lincoln right? He wanted to preserve the Union, but was he justified in fighting a war to do so? Didn't they have a right to secede?
No,
no,
they did not. And I say so, having a father that was born in Mobile, Alabama, and I was born across the bay in Pensacola, Florida. But my mother says at age 6 months, I shook the bars in the crib and said, for a Republican, let's go north. But I saw through the eyes of my father, who was a Southerner, and his ancestor was a personal aide to Robert E. Lee, and he was given the first autographed copy of his autobiography. So I had a family that was Northern and Southern, and seen it through their eyes, but Lincoln was absolutely right. The inalienable right that people had to be equal in not having equal opportunity to achieve the pursuit of happiness.
It
did not exist.
That's the second paragraph. That's why I asked you what word. I think if you read the second paragraph, it becomes very easy to explain. But to stay with that first paragraph is different.
The second paragraph would support Lincoln in saying we should abolish slavery.
That's correct.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm giving it the lawyer's interpretation to the question.
I'm going to come back to you then. What do you think about that paragraph as a defense of secession? As a matter of fact, the war that was going on when this was written, the war that began at Concord Bridge, Paul Revere's Ride, has been called in history the Revolutionary War, the War of Rebellion, the War of Independence, and the War of Secession. Now, I think the last two names for that war are correct. It was not a revolutionary war in the sense that...
They didn't use rebellion, did they?
No.
At all.
They were right. There's a misuse of the word. But don't you think the right word for the war that was going on is the War of Independence or the War of Secession? They were seceding from the British Empire. Now, the southern states were seceding from the Federal Union. I can't get over the fact that those words somehow could be uttered by Jefferson Davis.
Well, that's why I had trouble asking you what the word was, and I think if you read the first paragraph alone, it is a paragraph that speaks to the creation of a distinct political entity and the right of people to do that. But I think it's dangerous to read the first paragraph without the second, is the short of it, because it's the second that would undercut it.
Jefferson Davis could not use the second.
That's correct. That's correct.
No.
The other thing that it seems to me that first paragraph helps us to do, I think I've said this some other time, Lincoln's statement, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, is not factually true if by a new nation you mean a sovereign state that would take its place among the, that is, and
the
yet,
Constitution.
that's right. So that's not, it isn't said 77 years ago, but if you take the word nation out and say that what came into being in 1776 was a new people, a separate people that didn't exist before.
And the ideas that became the underpinning for the Constitution.
That's correct. It's a remarkable document. That all three documents that are the America's Testament, the Declaration, the Constitution, which is also admirably brief in almost all its clauses, and the Gettysburg Address are amazingly brief statements. In fact, the genius of the Constitution is what is left unsaid, don't you think?
It is, and yet it draws from so many and such body of knowledge and wisdom. Aristotle, whom we haven't mentioned, certainly could be called a co-author.
Right. Thank you, President Vada and Senator Percy, for your participation in this discussion. And thank you, our viewers, for being with us on this occasion. We hope you will join us again as viewers of the third program in this series on America's Testament, in which we will discuss the preamble of the Constitution of the United States.